Mr. Chair, and I'm happy to stand and take a call on part one of this piece of legislation. I want to raise some new issues and new issues around topics that people have been talking about, because this is a very important piece of legislation. It is particularly important that we've managed to get almost unanimous support for this, for a number of reasons. It's always good when we can get some stability in legislation, but I remember being in the UK not long after two young schoolgirls were murdered by a school worker, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, and I remember the public furore that followed about where the failures were, how was this person allowed to be there, and there are a number of lessons I think we can learn from that particular case. But I think the most important point was that's a very difficult environment to be making policy in. And in fact, the discussions that we've had here on this piece of legislation in New Zealand have very much mirrored the discussions that were held in Britain following that terrible, tragic murder. And I think the fact that we've managed to get almost unanimous support, and I think for the police vetting provisions we do have unanimous support, means that should we, and fingers crossed that we never do, face such a tragedy in New Zealand, this Parliament can say that we came to what we believe to be a sensible compromise on police vetting that balanced the requirements on schools and the burden that comes with that, with the safety of children, and we can stand up and say that all parties in this House were in agreement that we had reached that compromise and not play the blame game that so often happens in politics following such a tragedy. But the things that we can learn from that case, and these are the issues that I want to raise, which is that we've come to a position on police vetting that I think most people are comfortable with, but police vetting provisions in themselves are not going to keep children safe. This isn't something that says to us that we can now take our eye off that ball, that we can now not worry about the safety of our children in schools. We still do need to be vigilant about this, because what happened in the United Kingdom with that terrible murder was that in fact this gentleman was known to police, but a number of the charges that they were trying to bring against him for rape and for offences against a child were never taken to prosecution, so they didn't end up in the database that was used for the vet, despite the fact that this was someone who was known to the police. And also, because the police were under such pressure at that time, because they had funding shortages, because they had staffing shortages, administrative staffing shortages, that sometimes these things were not being entered into the police system in time. So that there were a number of charges that this gentleman had faced that should have been in the police computer, which would have shown up in the police vet, but they weren't there because there was too big a lag time with the police entering those details in.
Well, lag time's not quite the right thing. If he was doing a lag...
Yes, that's a fair comment, Mr. Ballard. Helpful as always. But my point really is, and when we're going through a very heated discussion in New Zealand about the role of administrative staff in the public sector, when we're going through a difficult economic period in terms of financial constraints on the government, and it's the same point that I raised when we passed the increases in DNA legislation. The police must be funded properly, because if they're not, then this is not worth the paper that it's written on. And more than that, even though they would not be considered frontline services, we need the staff who are going to be there, who are going to ensure that the kind of information that will be helpful to schools when they want to vet an individual is there, and is there on time, so that we don't end up in the situation that they did in the UK, where someone slipped through the net and the most tragic outcome occurred because of that. And it's a point that I really do want to make, because you can pass all the legislation in the world and it means nothing if the resources in terms of money and the staff are not there to ensure that the clauses that we're passing are able to be implemented as they were intended by this Parliament. So, Mr Chair, I'm very pleased that we've come to this compromise on police vetting. Mr Chair.
I call Moana making.
Well, I'll just finish off this comment and I'll make a... Thank you. Okay. Mr Mallard informs me that I will go until 5:02, at which point I will sit down so that the Honourable Member Roger Douglas can take a call. We've got to report progress.
Order. We're on part one of the bill.
Mr Chair, the only other part that I wanted to comment on, I would appreciate the Minister's comments on this, is the amendment in the name of my colleague Grant Robertson, which is a requirement for the Minister to advise the House of changes to criteria for enrolment in the correspondence school. And I congratulate my colleague Grant Robertson on bringing this amendment to the House. It is incredibly important. The correspondence school is an important entity. It provides education for a number of people who, particularly in remote rural areas, and are unable to access that, but also to people who for other reasons are not able to go through mainstream school. Any changes in criteria could have a significant impact on our communities, and I think in terms of transparency, it would be, I think this clause would be very helpful, and I'd be interested in the Minister's comments on that.